What if the very fabric of your spiritual reality, specifically regarding the sacred bloodline chosen by the divine, was stitched together with the silk of a grand mirage? Ponder the chilling thought that the greatest sleight of hand in human history was not concealed in some dusty, forgotten tomb, but rather paraded boldly through the stained glass of holy cathedrals and projected onto the silver screens of global cinema. In this hallowed moment, we initiate a pilgrimage to dismantle a perspective so artfully carved by the sculptors of antiquity that it has eclipsed the consciousness of billions across uncounted ages. Our focus turns to the progeny of Israel, that consecrated inheritance, the vital essence cascading from Abraham to Isaac and pulsing down through the veins of Jacob. Their visages bore no kinship to the pale frescoes that grace the plaster of your sanctuary, nor did they reflect the cinematic avatars that have danced before your gaze since the innocence of childhood. Attune your spirit now to the murmurs of the primordial past and the rigorous demands of sacred study as they beckon us toward a startling contemplation. The authentic Israelites, those souls who traversed the scorching dunes with Moses, who cemented the foundations of Solomon's temple, and who beheld the Messiah's own face, were of a fundamentally different breed. They carried flesh embraced by the fierce sun, abundant in deep melanin, not merely bronzed or olive, but profound and dark, mirroring the ancient soils of the Near East and the rich earth from which humanity was first molded. We teeter now on the edge of a great revelation, poised to shine a light on this reality, using the very texts the world claims to honor, the Holy Scriptures, augmented by the wisdom of learned historians. Is your soul fortified for such an unveiling? Do you possess the spiritual resilience required to endure the shattering of traditions that have stood for centuries? For the moment your eyes lock upon the truth we are destined to reveal, the curtain is irreparably torn, and there can be no retreat into the soothing embrace of the former fantasy. Every porcelain figure in the Nativity, every blockbuster epic, and every stained glass window depicting a fair-skinned, blue-eyed patriarch becomes a monument to how the world has radically reconstructed the divine image. Veracity has never been mute. The proofs have been dormant, patient, awaiting the arrival of those possessing the spiritual vision to perceive them. It has remained openly displayed for 2 millennia, inscribed within the cadences of Hebrew, Aramaic, and the Greek tongues. The very rocks of archaeology murmur this secret. The science of genealogy confirms it, and chronicles penned long before the armadas of empires hoisted their sails validate it. Nevertheless, this holy actuality was submerged beneath shifting dunes of cultural reinterpretation, systematic appropriation, and the tireless revisionism of history. On this destined night, we shall sever the mist and gaze clearly into the past. We will journey through the biblical narrative, passage by passage, braiding the holy text with ancient manuscripts and anchoring it to the discoveries of the modern era. We shall investigate scientific disclosures that resonate in perfect symphony with the truths the ancient scrolls have been silently proclaiming for eons. Our spirits will drift back to the cradle of civilization, wandering the dusty bazaars of Jerusalem to witness the countenances that truly inhabited the biblical world. Yet, before we advance another stride, let a singular inquiry vibrate within the depths of your being. Why does this matter hold such gravity? Why should your heart be stirred by the hue of ancestors who trod upon the soil thousands of years ago? It is because the core of identity is inviolable, and truth serves as the bedrock for all that is deemed holy. When mortal hands remold the identity of a nation to reflect their own likeness, it casts a pall over divine precepts and warps the very reflection of the Creator. Contemplate the decree that roars across time, "Thou shalt not steal." For centuries, Western powers plundered far more than bullion and territory. They confiscated a heritage. They asserted ownership over the very souls and histories of the ancient faithful. They seized the patriarchs, the prophets, the monarchs, and even the Prince of Peace, repainting them in hues that soothed their own vanity. They transmuted the melanated Semitic bloodline into figures of European resemblance, an act not merely of artistic license, but of total dominion. This sculpting was birthed from bias, molded by the grip of historical power, taking root so deeply that even the children of the promise began to accept the face of a stranger as their own. Even they succumbed to the belief that the chosen were fair of skin, for that is the image branded onto every altar, every sacred tome, and every icon of veneration. However, the Holy Writ chants a divergent melody, and tonight we shall permit the scriptures to thunder their own veracity. We will examine the verses that have been glossed over, reinterpreted, or stripped of their primordial vitality. We shall plunge into the Hebrew language, unearthing terms that sketch a portrait so vivid and undeniable that you will marvel at the endurance of the deception. Is your intellect prepared for the dismantling of its paradigms? Are you steeled to interrogate the bedrock of what you accepted as biblical history? What we are poised to reveal will not simply alter your perspective of yesterday. It will transmute your comprehension of the year 2026 and the ages to come. It will shine a light upon the archaic patterns of subjugation, the mechanics of injustice, and the spiritual combat that has raged across the celestial realms for millennia. The mystery of the divine's people is not sequestered in a vault within the Vatican, nor buried in a concealed chamber. It reposes openly upon the leaves of the Bible that likely gathers dust on your mantle at this very instant. The Hebrew scrolls, the Greek manuscripts, the Aramaic whispers, they all weave an identical tapestry, one that has been dyed over by centuries of Western exegesis. That which lies interred within these ancient words beckons a profound introspection of the soul. Can you withstand this abyss of exploration? For once we unlock this gate, the entire weave of modern spiritual comprehension begins to unravel and stitch itself anew. Everything you presumed regarding lineage, regarding the elect, regarding the prophecies of antiquity, it all shifts under the piercing light of truth. Let us commence with a foundational verity, a verse that should compel every believer to pause and tremble. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 7. The Creator addresses his elect, unveiling the enigma of their selection. They were summoned not for their might, nor for their vast multitudes. True dominion never dwelt within the crushing grip of a tyrant's gauntlet, nor in the endless sprawl of conquering kingdoms, nor even in the terrifying brilliance of futuristic arsenals that force entire civilizations to their knees in silent dread. The great architect did not turn his burning gaze upon you, nor brand you with his seal, because you thrived as a legion, outnumbering the celestial fires. No, it was because you were the faintest of all whispers, the humblest fragment among the tribes, a scattering barely visible against the tapestry of nations. The Infinite One purposefully breathed his spirit into the broken, singling out those whom the colossi of this age would brush aside without effort, discard like chaff, or trample into the dust while never breaking stride. Stop here, and let the crushing weight of that enigma seep into the very marrow of your existence. Permit your soul to drift untethered through the endless, rippling echoes of such a terrifyingly divine decree. If the cosmos itself aligned with the most diminutive of clans, if the Ancient of Days selected a minority to carry the burning torch of his promise, then a haunting question arises. Why do our eyes perpetually witness the biblical children of Israel rendered in the exact likeness of the world's most overwhelming hegemonies? Why do they bear the countenance of Europa, reflecting a bloodline that has stood across the aeons as the most teeming, the most indomitable, and the most commanding presence to ever stride across the surface of this terror? Such a blinding contradiction ought to force every spirit that still possesses the spark of logic to freeze in their journey and relentlessly question the doctrines branded onto their consciousness. For the sacred scrolls whisper with absolute transparency that the divine finger pointed to the scarcest of all human multitudes. Yet, the dominant tapestries of our faith paint these holy patriarchs with the visage of the conqueror, wearing the skin of those who have gripped the iron rod of authority, seized the horizon's limits, and reigned over the masses for 1,000 years. A deep dissonance vibrates here, a fractured chord in the cosmic symphony of truth that refuses to resolve into harmony. The saga has been twisted by the glacial currents of cultural revisionism, and the tendrils of this deception burrow far deeper into the bedrock of antiquity than your waking mind would dare to fantasize. Turn your inner eye to the primordial Hebrew tongue in Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 7. The term for fewest is miat, and it signifies a reality far more profound than a simple deficit in mathematical counting. It hums with the heavy frequency of total unimportance, of being the shadow the world looks through, of being discarded as valueless dross by the cold calculations of human kingdoms. This is the foundational vibration woven into the very identity of the outcast, the forgotten ghosts exiled to the rims of reality. The divine did not exalt a lineage fated to ascend the ziggurats of glory through systems of flesh and bone. Instead, he burned his mark upon those destined to be mocked, cast out, and ground into powder by the relentless gears of civilization's engine. He singled out a tribe that knew the taste of dust and the guttural scream for retribution, a people who would bend beneath the suffocating weight of a stranger's malice, and who would comprehend in the deepest abyss of their souls the starving need for a redeemer. This golden thread is stitched inextricably through the entire woven expanse of the ancient testaments. Over and over, the will of the cosmos favors the junior sibling over the heir, chooses the bondservant above the Lord, and crowns the lowly sheep-tender while ignoring the majesty of the enthroned monarch. He raises the wretched from the ash heap while forcing the arrogant to their knees, eternally rendering the vanguard as the rearguard and the rearguard as the vanguard. However, in the fog of our contemporary arrogance, we have somehow reversed this celestial algorithm, flipping the pyramid of revelation until it stands precariously upon its peak. We have sculpted the image of the chosen to mirror the very dynasties that have historically swum in oceans of privilege, brandished total dominion, and feasted upon every luxury the societies of men can offer. We have transmuted the holy legend into a bedtime story that fortifies the citadels of worldly authority, rather than a spiritual blade that questions their right to rule. The archaic seer Amos perceived this metaphysical law with a lucid vision that slices through the dark like a jagged shard of diamond. In chapter 9, verse 7, he releases a thunderclap designed to shake the bedrock beneath anyone who assumes they have unraveled the enigma of divine selection. Are you not as the offspring of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel? Thunders the voice of the sovereign Lord. Did I not guide Israel up from the soil of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? Halt there, and let those syllables traverse the vast wilderness of your consciousness. Here, the Infinite compares his covenant-bearers, the Israelites, directly to the Ethiopians, not merely as a phantom or a parable, but in a collision with reality that resists any comfortable explanation. He proclaims, with the full mass of the heavens pressing behind his utterance, that they are identical to the Ethiopians in his sight. The primordial Hebrew tongue employs the term kushim, a precise coordinate pointing to the ebony-skinned dwellers of ancient Ethiopia, the territories we now map as Sudan and the Horn of Africa. While learned sages, such as the architects of the Anchor Yale Bible commentary, frequently contend this is a poetic allegory of social rank rather than a literal reference to the pigment of the flesh, the visualization remains blindingly potent. This is no ephemeral, careless juxtaposition tossed effortlessly into the winds of prophecy. This is the Creator himself, drafting a direct, undeniable parallel between the carriers of his pact and one of the most notoriously dark-complexioned civilizations known to the ancient sphere. The Ethiopians were legendary across the sweep of the ancient Near East for their midnight-hued richness. Greek chroniclers burned descriptions of them into their papyrus scrolls. Roman scribes catalogued their visages, and Egyptian master craftsmen immortalized them in granite and pigment, with features that were undeniably of the African cradle. Therefore, when the Almighty announces the Israelites are as Ethiopians to him, he is releasing a profound revelation concerning their physical countenance, their standing, and their very coordinates within the family of man. Though many interpreters scramble to highlight the angle of social hierarchy, observing that Ethiopians were frequently perceived as distinct foreigners, as a tribe wholly other, who did not fit the standard caste of power and supremacy in the antique Mediterranean societies, so too were the children of Israel. Yet, this divine similitude gathers the destructive force of a hurricane when one truly comprehends the temporal context in which it was roared from the heavens. Amos prophesied in an epoch when Israel had grown obese with fortune and bloated with vanity, beginning to perceive themselves as genetically superior to the pagan nations circling their borders. They had surrendered to the toxic seduction that their holy contract rendered them intrinsically finer, more precious than the remainder of the human race. But the Lord, vibrating through the vocal cords of Amos, shatters their hallucination and drags them back to their true reflection. You are indistinguishable from the Ethiopians in my eyes. You are not the imperial juggernaut. You are not the teeming majority. You are not the supreme judges who sit upon the clouds and peer down with disdain upon the rest of creation. You are merely the ones who have been levitated solely by my mercy, just as I have reached into the mire to hoist other downtrodden tribes throughout the chronicles of time, rendering the message stark and unavoidable. The lineage selected by the divine was never fated to lace up the boots of the tyrant. They were designed to stand shoulder to shoulder, in spirit and bloody truth, with the broken. They were never meant to exist as the crushing, dominant majority, but rather to intimately grasp the soul-carving reality of being exiled, displaced, and profoundly misread by the entire world. However, across the shifting sands of the eons, contemporary doctrine has somehow managed to contort this hallowed chronicle, completely upending the primordial truth until the sacred touches the profane. Instead of recognizing the Almighty's anointed bloodline as brethren to the Cushites, bound in spirit with the downtrodden, with the forgotten souls and the silenced voices at the fringes of the earth, we have committed a paradox, casting them in the marble likeness of their very captors. We have chiseled their features to mirror the tyrants and grand potentates who, for centuries, cracked the whip of subjugation over the backs of the innocent. This grand inversion is far more than a mere scribal error in our chronicles. It is a catastrophe of the spirit, a distortion that hangs the holy gospel by its feet. Rather than the divine presence standing shoulder to shoulder with the pulverized against the pulverizers, this counterfeit icon suggests the Creator sanctions the very chains that bind mankind. Yet, the archaic parchments beckon us to tear through this illusion, summoning us back to the raw, unvarnished vision of reality. It whispers to our spirits, regardless of how it shakes the foundations of our comfortable dogmas. Within the book of Jeremiah, chapter 14, verse 2, we unearth a buried shard of this celestial enigma, a specific nuance that the gaze of the multitude has failed to grasp. Judah is in lamentation, and her gates languish in despair. They are black unto the very dust, and the wail of Jerusalem has spiraled up to the stars. The primordial Hebrew utterance rendered here as black is times kadar, times a word vibrating with the heavy frequencies of twilight, of deep mourning, and of being utterly charred by the relentless sun or the weight of sorrow. Now, the academics and commentators, safe within their high towers of ivory, often wave this away as mere poetic flourish, claiming it speaks only of a spiritual gloom or the shadow of grief. But the Hebrew tongue is far more carnal, rooted deeply in the soil of the physical world. Kadar times speaks not merely of a shadow upon the psyche, but of a visible darkness palpable to the waking eye. Though the surrounding stanzas chant of profound agony, the word itself is tethered to the tangible reality of pigment and shade. The scripture unveils that when the children of Judah wail, when the crushing weight of the cosmos descends upon them, they darken unto the earth. Their organic, biological reflex to trauma is to radiate their inherent obsidian nature. This suggests that such deep pigmentation was woven into the very fabric of their being, their fundamental baseline during these epochs of heavy grief, rather than some alien complexion that materialized from the void. Pause and meditate upon the logic of the ancients. If a tribe turns to the shade of midnight when they mourn, what hue did they possess before the first tear fell? If profound darkness is their biological answer to woe, then rich melanin must be the canvas of their natural existence, glowing beneath whatever tribulations they suffer. This is no solitary anomaly. It is a rhythmic drumbeat that echoes across the entire tapestry of the Old Covenant. Over and over, we witness the children of Israel manifesting shadow, blackness, and sun-scorched skin as they walk through the furnaces of their history. Yet, these luminous markers have been systematically whitewashed, intellectualized, and obscured by gatekeepers who cherish comfortable theories far more than the abrasive edges of truth. In the Book of Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 8, we confront perhaps the most visceral, undeniable portrait of the Israelite visage in all of Holy Writ. Their countenance is blacker than a coal. They wander unrecognized. Their skin shrinks tight against their skeletal frame, withered and arid, resembling an ancient, brittle branch. The Hebrew resonance used here for blacker is times hashak, times, signifying to dim, to darken, to be swallowed by the dusk. Yet, behold the comparison the prophet selects. He does not merely state they are swarthy. He proclaims them to be blacker than the very charred embers of the fire. According to deep spiritual insights, this is not the language of allegory, but a raw, somatic account of how these people appeared when famine stripped them to the core. As observed in scholarly tomes like the New International Commentary, the verse wails on, "They are not known in the streets." And we must ask, why is this so? Is it because their visage had morphed so drastically, or perchance because their true, foundational aesthetic was finally being laid bare after eons of concealment? The haunting refrain, "Their skin cleaves to their bones," illustrates a people starved, hollowed out, and reduced to their most elemental, primal form. When one peels away the robes of status, the gleaming ornaments of prosperity, and the artificial masks of civilization, what remains beneath? Only the natural pigment, the true ethnic essence, the authentic genetic inheritance bequeathed by the forefathers. And that authentic legacy, as whispered by the dust of these ancient texts, was black, blacker than coal, a darkness so profound it would arrest the gaze of any who beheld it. But herein lies the deepest enigma of the passage. The scripture declares they are not known in the streets. In the Hebrew tongue, the word for known is times nakar asterisk, signifying to distinguish, to recognize, to validate the identity of another. These people were no longer perceived for who they truly were. This resonates with the tragedy of a true identity that has been warped, reshaped, and usurped by a fabrication. The world ceases to identify the genuine article because it has been conditioned to venerate the illusion. They fail to see the ancient roots because their minds have been trained to swallow the conventional deception. For century upon rolling century, the true visage of the biblical Israelites has walked unrecognized through the thoroughfares of history. Humanity brushes shoulders with their progeny every single day, completely blind to the regal bloodline standing before them. They gaze upon artifacts in museums and consume documentaries, yet the spark of remembrance never ignites, for they have been programmed to seek a countenance that simply does not exist. The princes of Israel, as depicted in this very chapter of Lamentations, were once likened to the purity of snow and the whiteness of milk, glowing like rubies in their vitality. But then a great shadow descended. Now their form is chronicled as darker than the deepest abyss, unrecognized and forgotten in the streets. We are compelled to ask, what truly shifted in the cosmos? What immense celestial power reached down to twist the destiny of these spirits, wrenching them from their primordial grandeur into the stark and gritty reality we behold in this present age? The ancient parchments murmur secrets of a colossal tribulation, a fiery furnace of suffering, bondage, and banishment that burned away every falsehood to reveal the undeniable, ancient roots buried beneath. Every fabricated mask of pale porcelain, every modification imposed by culture, and the stolen regalia of fallen empires evaporated like morning mist, sparing nothing but the raw, unalloyed truth of their blood lineage. And that fundamental reality, concealed deep within the bedrock of time, bore the complexion of the midnight heavens, an absolute, undeniable darkness. A darkness so vast and profound that it demanded to be etched into the Holy Scriptures, serving as the very foundation of their identity within the gaze of the divine. A hue so intense it marked them as the eternal other, standing in defiant contrast to the ancient world's fragile ladders of caste and dominion. We stand now upon the cliff edge of a profound enigma, a question that lingers like a ghost at the periphery of our shared awareness, a mystery that has been largely shunned until this moment. If the patriarchs of the covenant walked the earth with skin kissed and burned by the ferocious intensity of the desert sun, if their countenances mirrored the splendor of the Ethiopians, with visages as rich and deep as polished ebony, then from what strange realm of imagination did the pale Messiah arise? From what source was the image of the lawgiver drawn, depicting Moses with the countenance of the northern tribes rather than the weathered wanderers of the sands? By what hidden mechanism were eyes of piercing sapphire and hair of spun gold substituted for the truth? The answer unveils a monumental, centuries-long erasure, a systematic pillaging of heritage, unlike anything witnessed in history. The seeds of this great metamorphosis were sown in the dim twilight of the First Era, coiling through the infancy of the faith, swelling like a tide during the Middle Ages, and reaching a crescendo as empires stretched their greedy fingers across the globe. This was no mere twist of fate, but a sorcery of influence, a deliberate recasting of holy icons into the reflection of the conquerors, effectively pilfering the divine birthright from the melanated and gifting it to the fair. Let there be no confusion. This was not the hand of fortune spinning the wheel, nor was it the innocent progression of artistic expression or the natural translation of customs across borders. It was a weaponized aesthetic, a calculated campaign of imagery forged to strengthen thrones and overflow the treasuries of kings. While academics may trace the Messiah's shifting visage from a youthful Roman shepherd to a majestic, long-haired northern monarch, the shadow of power looming behind it is unmistakable. If the divine bears the face of the ruler, then the ruler's dominion over the earth is rendered holy. To portray the Savior in alabaster is to stamp a seal of celestial approval upon the prejudices of men and the earthly structures of control. This grand illusion was spun through manifold layers of deceit. First, the very tongues of the ancients Hebrew and Greek were contorted, their descriptors of flesh and hue reimagined. Then followed the visual rewriting, where master canvases slowly morphed the rugged, Semitic visage into the delicate, softened features of the West. And finally, a heavy theological veil was dropped. Dogmas that transmuted flesh into mere metaphor, spiritualizing away the inconvenient realities of melanin and ancestral blood. As centuries bled into millennia, these fabrications calcified into accepted reality, burying the memory of the swap so deep it was all but forgotten. The falsehood became the cornerstone, the unquestioned absolute, against which truth itself was measured and found lacking. To dare speak against this image was to court scorn, to be branded a heretic, a radical, or an instigator of chaos. Yet the ancient scrolls stood immutable. The ink upon the parchment never once whispered the name of Europe. The stones and shards excavated from the silent earth refused to testify on behalf of this pale reimagining. The very code of life, the intricate helix of history, offered no sanctuary to the theory of a light-skinned patriarch. Every fragment of genuine truth points relentlessly southward, toward a people born of the sun, reflecting the deep, resonant hues of the African continent. Ponder the ancestral echoes within 22 ancients from the Copper Age. Science unveils that over 50 to 60% of their blood sang the song of the Levant, carrying genes that painted them in deep olive and earth tones, worlds apart from the pale north. Even the language they spoke holds the keys, unlocking secrets that have been kept in the shadows for aeons. The ancient designation for Hebrew springs from a vibration meaning to traverse, to cross over, to exist as a stranger passing through the veil. It speaks of a tribe that could not dissolve into the background, souls who stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the empires surrounding them, instantly marked as other. And what trait declares foreigner with more volume than the very canvas of the skin? It was their very countenance, the undeniable stamp of a distinct lineage, the blood of the patriarchs, that announced their origin from a distant and sun-drenched realm. Recall Abraham, the great father, summoned by the voice to sever his earthly ties, to forsake the familiar warmth of his hearth, and wander into a land where he would forever remain the outsider. The ancient texts label him a stranger, a word heavy with implication, suggesting a man whose very face and form set him apart from the natives of that land. This pilgrimage from the river valleys to the Promised Land was not merely a migration across sand and stone. It was a preservation of essence, a sacred safeguarding of culture and bloodline. He carried within him a holy seed, a genetic signature so potent that his children's children, for millennia to come, would bear the undeniable mark of his image. And that image, as the scriptures quietly testify, was painted in the hues of the earth, dark, rich, and mirroring the features of the sons of Cush. The oath sworn by the divine was not merely a whisper to the soul, it was inscribed into the very double helix of his blood. The divine architect cast his gaze across the obsidian canvas of the cosmos, proclaiming a vow that echoed through eternity. His holy bloodline would flourish until it rivaled the burning constellations above and outnumbered the infinite grains of sand upon the shores of time. He swore a thunderous oath that through the loins of Abraham, a blessing would cascade upon every tribe on this terrestrial sphere. This was no fleeting allegory, but a covenant etched in crimson, a sacred legacy woven into the very double helix of existence, destined to flow like a mighty river through the veins of physical generations. If the ancient patriarch Abraham bore the rich, sun-drenched essence of ebony skin within his soul and marrow, then the immutable laws of creation dictate that his progeny would inevitably inherit that same resplendent, majestic, genetic mantle. It follows with the certainty of the dawn chasing the dusk that Isaac would carry the deep hues of the fertile earth, and Jacob, in turn, would reflect the profound, resonant complexion of those who came before him. The 12 tribes of Israel would rise like cedars as a people of rich color, and the Anointed One himself. Springing from the ancient root of Jesse and the royal line of David, would walk the soil of this world cloaked in that same dark, imperial radiance. This profound realization is not birthed from the fragile womb of conjecture, nor is it swayed by the tempestuous winds of modern political maneuvering. Instead, it represents the undeniable harmonic convergence of elemental biological laws, sacred genealogical records, and the enduring, unedited chronicles of human history. Every strand of evidence weaves a singular, undeniable tapestry, unveiling a biblical Israelite nation steeped in melanin, standing in stark and holy contrast to the alabaster depictions that have long usurped the altars of contemporary devotion. Yet, in the hushed cathedral of the Spirit, one might whisper a trembling question: why does such a distinction carry the weight of worlds? Why should the faithful of this present age burden their hearts with the complexion of saints long past? It matters because truth is the unshakable foundation of all reality, and because identity serves as the spiritual anchor that holds the soul against the storm. To truly comprehend the specific vessel the Almighty selected to bear the weight of His covenant is to unlock the profound mysteries of what the divine actually holds dear. When the scales fall from your eyes, and you perceive that the Most High specifically chose a people of shadow and earth to carry His holy promise, when you grasp that the Savior walked with a countenance mirroring the children of the African continent, when you awaken to the startling truth that the entire saga of the Scriptures orbits around a people who mirror modern Africans and their scattered diaspora, the entire world tilts violently on its axis. It fundamentally transmutes the very lens through which the sacred scrolls are consumed, turning familiar verses into revolutionary revelations. It reconstructs your understanding of ancient prophecies, alters how you interpret the unfolding tumult of current events, and completely reframes your vision of divine justice in a fractured world. It revolutionizes your comprehension of the spiritual warfare that has raged for centuries, a celestial conflict between the blinding light of truth and the suffocating shadows of deception, between a rightful inheritance and a history that was plundered in the night. The ripples of this thunderous revelation extend far beyond the fragile, dusty parchments of antiquity. They pierce the very heart of contemporary faith, reshaping every theological debate, fueling every cry for social righteousness, and influencing every political discourse that threatens to tear us asunder. When you internalize the reality that the chosen vessels of God were the downtrodden and the oppressed, rather than the imperial conquerors of history, when you realize that the Messiah stood shoulder to shoulder with the outcast and the marginalized, utterly rejecting the velvet comforts of the privileged elite, when you see that biblical prophecy speaks of the glorious restoration of a scattered, despised remnant, rather than the perpetual supremacy of the powerful, the spiritual landscape is irrevocably transformed. Let it be proclaimed from the mountaintops that this journey is not about sowing seeds of discord or erecting stone walls between the tribes of humanity. This is not a summons to harbor bitterness in the heart or to kindle the destructive fires of racial resentment. Nay, this is a holy reclamation of lost truth, a resurrection of a stolen identity, and a return to the raw, authentic narrative that has been buried beneath centuries of cultural whitewash and reinterpretation. The intention is never to strip heritage from any soul, but rather to restore what was deliberately obscured to its rightful place in the glorious light of day. It is to hand back the biblical legacy to its rightful heirs and to polish the dim mirror so the true, unblemished image of God's people may shine forth once more. To allow the Messiah to be perceived as he truly walked the earth, and to let the prophet Moses stand tall in his authentic, sun-darkened majesty. To permit the sacred story to speak with its own thunderous voice, liberated from the suffocating filters of empire and the interpretations of the West. This resurrection of truth serves the highest good of all creation. Even those of European descent are blessed, for they finally behold the real Savior, the genuine patriarchs, and the true champions of the faith. They are granted the grace to connect with a Creator who favored the crushed over the crusher, the oppressed over the oppressor, a God who exalted the humble whilst bringing the arrogant low, who takes his stand firmly on the side of justice against the seemingly impregnable citadels of privilege. For those of dark skin, there is a profound, balm-like healing, for they finally gaze upon their own reflection in the sacred looking-glass of Scripture, to trace their own features in the countenances of the holy ones, and to know in their very bones that the covenant promises were whispered to ancestors who bore their exact likeness, ancestors who tasted the bitter cup of oppression just as they have, and who knew the sound of the desperate cry for liberation and divine rescue. Indeed, all of humanity profits, for the clear, piercing light of truth always nourishes the spirit far better than the comfortable, sugary decay of illusions. Grasping the authentic biblical story empowers every soul to better fathom the Creator's pulsating heart for justice and his deep, abiding care for the marginalized of the earth. It reveals his grand design to raise the lowly from the dust and humble the proud. What has lain dormant beneath centuries of foreign interpretation now rises like a phoenix to invite a total re-evaluation of the faith. Do you possess the spiritual fortitude to embrace a transformation of this seismic magnitude? Is your spirit prepared to gaze upon the Messiah as he truly existed in the flesh? Are you ready to meet Moses face to face in his actual, unvarnished form? Can you accept the reality that the chosen vessels of the Almighty were dark-skinned, African-featured souls, ethnically kindred to the very groups that history has so often trampled and cast aside? The ancient Hebrew scrolls hold dozens more whispers and thunderous shouts that buttress this profound and earth-shattering understanding. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5, the beloved cries out with bold, unshakable assurance, "I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon." The Hebrew term utilized for black in this passage is shahora, a word that unequivocally and unapologetically denotes dark, dusky, or black-skinned beauty. While some modern translations attempt to dilute this potency by rendering it merely as dark or swarthy, the original tongue remains steadfast and unapologetically clear. Many scholars have tried to dismiss this as a mere tan from the relentless sun, denying the inherent blackness of the beloved, yet the text stands firm as a pillar of truth against the erosion of time. Deep within the hallowed scrolls of ancient commentary, a solitary voice ascends from the dust of ages past a woman declaring the truth of her existence. She does not speak of her midnight skin as a curse to be born, but rather as a celestial masterpiece, sculpted by the very fingers of the Almighty in a revelation of pure, unblemished majesty. You will find no tremor of apology in her resonance, nor even the faintest shadow of shame cast upon her spirit for the rich ebony hue that clothes her temple. Nay, her proclamation rings out as a hymn of absolute glory, weaving her physical reality into the holy fabric of the Creator's chosen bloodline. The imagery she invokes, comparing herself to the dark, regal tents of Kedar, carries a spiritual gravity that vibrates through the corridors of time. For Kedar was far more than a simple title. It was a kingdom immersed in the burning, gold-drenched sands of Arabia, a sanctuary for tribes whose very faces held the profound, endless mysteries of the starlit night. Their shelters were spun from the deepest jet-black wool of goats, rising as stark, formidable monuments against the blinding desert horizon, legendary throughout the ancient world for their distinct and shadow-like grandeur. To align one's own countenance with these revered structures was to embrace darkness not as a void where light is absent, but as a defining, potent force of one's very being. However, that single conjunction in the translation, but beautiful, betrays a fracture in human perception, laying bare the deep-rooted prejudices that fogged the vision of the ancients concerning the breathtaking allure of the dusk. The speaker rises high above the judgment of society, testifying with unyielding conviction that her darkness does not temper her radiance. On the contrary, she stands worthy, awe-inspiring, and wholly embraced within the divine sight. This sentiment echoes a war fought across eons, suggesting that the shadows of scorn cast upon dark-skinned souls in the biblical era extend their reach all the way to our current year of 2026. Yet, it was from this very furnace of affliction that the Almighty selected the vessels for his eternal promise. He intentionally anointed a lineage destined to traverse the fires of racial scrutiny, to withstand the bitter sting of ethnic division, and to carry the burden of persecution born solely from the shade of their creation. The divine choice descended upon those who would know, in the depths of their marrow, the sorrow of being measured by the scales of fleeing appearance rather than the eternal substance of the Spirit. He selected those rejected for their heritage when they should have been exalted. This profound thread of identity and perception is woven without a break through the entire magnificent tapestry of the biblical saga. Turn your gaze to Joseph, the dreamer, sold into the iron shackles of bondage, who merged so flawlessly into the Egyptian empire that his own flesh and blood, his brothers, could not separate him from the natives when they came begging for bread during the Great Famine. One is compelled to halt and meditate upon this enigma. How is it possible for a Hebrew son to dissolve perfectly into the sea of the Egyptian multitude if there existed a vast chasm of difference in their skin tones or facial structures? The revelation strikes with stark simplicity. There was no divide. Joseph mirrored the Egyptians because the blood pulsing through his veins carved a likeness that was indistinguishable from the lords of the land. He carried the intense kiss of the sun upon his skin, the undeniable features of the African continent etched into his visage, allowing him to pass as a true child of the Nile, even before the eyes of those who once knew him best. The ancients of Egypt left behind their own immutable truth, chiseled into stone and vibrant in pigments, a testimony fortified by their sacred scrolls, and even the silent whispers of mummified remains examined by modern science, all confirming they were predominantly children of the dark, rich earth. Upon the walls of their eternal resting places, they painted themselves in the shades of the fertile soil and the midnight sky, using a visual language that proudly anchored their heritage deep within African roots. They never viewed themselves as strangers to the land. They were the very heartbeat of the African continent, indivisible from the motherland that cradled their civilization. In contrast, the vivid murals of the Beni Hassan tombs depict Semitic visitors not as identical, but often with reddish-brown complexions, distinct yet kindred, sometimes merely a shade lighter than the masters of the Nile. If Joseph could disappear into their ranks, if Moses could be raised as a prince of the high court, and if the entire nation of Israel could dwell there for 400 years, separated only by their devotion to God, and not by their countenances, then the Israelites and the Egyptians must have been mirror reflections of one another. The truth stands firm that the Egyptians were the visage of Africa, possessing skin kissed by the equator, features broad and powerful, and a lineage inextricably entwined with the populations south of the Sahara. Modern genetic explorations into these ancients consistently unveil the biological markers of Africa, rejecting the theories of European or Middle Eastern origins in favor of a deeper, southern ancestry. There lies another profound revelation, often obscured from the casual observer, buried within the 12th chapter of the Book of Numbers, a key that unlocks the ancient mystery of identity. Here, the voices of Miriam and Aaron rise in sharp dissent against Moses. their grievance rooted deeply in his union with a woman of Ethiopia. The sacred text explicitly employs the word Cushet, a direct reference to a daughter of Cush, that vast realm spanning the majestic territories we identify today as Sudan and Ethiopia. If the great lawgiver took a bride from the sun-drenched lands of Cush, and if this holy marriage was sanctified in the eyes of the Creator despite the grumbling of men, what secret does this whisper regarding the countenance of Moses himself? Had there been a jarring contrast in the color of their skin or the mold of their features, the scribes surely would have etched this disparity into the chronicles of the time. Yet, the storm that gathered was not one of visual clash or racial incongruity. It was a dispute concerning the sanctity of the covenant bloodline, the rigid boundaries of the tribe, and the hierarchy of spiritual power within the camp. The scripture offers no hint that the Ethiopian bride stood apart visually from the daughters of Israel. It suggests only that she hailed from a foreign nation, born of a different soil and custom. This implies a shared visual harmony, where the Israelite and the Ethiopian stood as kin in flesh, even if they were strangers in flag. The friction was born of culture and creed, a matter of spirit and law, rather than a division based upon the physical architecture of their beings. Moses could join his soul to a woman of Cush without creating a visual paradox, for the sons of Jacob and the children of Cush drank from the same ancient well of genetic heritage. Listen closely to the prophet Zephaniah, who in chapter 3, verse 10, unveils a vision of worshippers emerging from beyond the great rivers of Ethiopia, calling them the daughter of my dispersed the scattered jewels of the divine. These lost sheep, these fragments of the holy nation, are pinpointed not merely near, but far beyond the Ethiopian waters, deep within the pulsing heart of the African expanse. If the breath of God blew his people into the depths of Africa, if they took root beyond the rivers and established their altars in the cradle of the continent, then they must have walked among the ancients as shadows walk comfortably within the night. They must have shared the same dark beauty, the same genetic song, and the same ethnic majesty as the land that held them in its embrace. To sow a sacred seed in foreign earth, where the soil rejects its nature, is to sentence that life to a silent, withering death. A lineage cannot withstand the crushing gravity of the ages if it stands as a solitary anomaly amidst a sea of strangers. The only true sanctuary for preservation lies in the deep resonance of blood, where the pulse of the individual merges indistinguishably with the rhythm of the host nation, creating a seamless union that mirrors the elemental architecture of the flesh itself, thereby permitting the eternal fire of spiritual heritage and the ancient rites of the ancestors to blaze furiously, untainted by the winds of dilution. Banish the thought that the evidence of this sun-drenched ancestry is concealed in quiet murmurs or fragmented relics. On the contrary, it surges like a torrential river through every verse of the primordial covenant and the new revelations alike. It is inextricably embroidered into the tapestry of generations, roared through the prophetic visions of the seers, chronicled in the royal archives of kings, chanted in the sacred psalms, chiseled into the tablets of the law, and sealed in the prophecy of the Anointed One. Even the Messiah himself, the very beacon of the cosmos, is unveiled within the hallowed scrolls, with a clarity that defies modern invention, most notably within the apocalyptic visions of St. John, where he bears a divine countenance that stands in absolute, blinding contrast to the pale, marble idols sculpted by Western hands in the twilight of later centuries. The ancient texts describe a crown of sovereign glory, hair possessing the undeniable texture of pure wool, shimmering with the absolute brilliance of snow upon a mountain peak. His eyes burned with the terrifying intensity of a furnace fire, while his feet appeared as burnished bronze, radiating the deep, rich glow of copper that has been purified within the violent heart of a smelter. Contemplate specifically the alchemy of brass thrown into the inferno. When such metal embraces the heat, it does not whiten, but ripens into a profound, dark obsidian hue, a celestial signifier of his true earthly appearance. Let it be known that these descriptions are not drifting allegories or vague poetry intended to bewilder the spirit. They are precise, deliberate portraits of skin that gleams like roasted copper, and the comparison of his locks to wool unlocks a gateway to a deeper understanding of his identity. For wool holds a specific structural geometry, a spiraling spirit and coil that bears absolutely no kinship to the flowing silken curtains of hair found among the tribes of the frozen north. Instead, it testifies to the tightly wound, crown-like majesty that organically graces the heads of the children born from the womb of the sun-bathed African continent. This imagery summons the very essence of the lamb's fleece, defined by its resilient, helical nature, a texture symbolizing unconquerable strength and density. Such prophetic visions of the risen king harmonize flawlessly with the ancestral countenance of the ancient Semites, a people whose blood hummed with the same vibrational frequency as their African brethren. Nowhere within this divine gallery do we encounter the alabaster complexions or straight tresses that Renaissance brushes would later force upon the image of the Savior. Those who walk the corridors of history witness the slow, deliberate metamorphosis of his image, mutating from a beardless youth of Rome into the long-haired, Europeanized figure of the Middle Ages. Even the formidable Apostle Paul, scattering his epistles like potent seeds across the breadth of the empire, left breadcrumbs of undeniable truth concerning the pedigree and visage of the early faithful. When he etched his fiery admonitions to the Galatians, he spoke of carrying a heavy, profound burden, enduring the lash of hatred for the sake of the cross, and bearing upon his own physical vessel the very scars and branding marks of the Messiah. Perceive that his tribulation was not solely of the soul, but of the blood. He was hunted because his very face betrayed him, as a son of Abraham, visibly distinct and alien within a hostile imperial world. His skin served as the banner of the chosen, attracting the wrath of a Roman order that looked upon the darker hues of the earth with supreme disdain and imperial arrogance. The cradle of the early faith was never rocked in the West, but was nurtured by the warm, ancient hands of Africa, Asia Minor, and the sunlit coasts of the Eastern Sea. The towering citadels of holy intellect ascended from the sands of Alexandria and the bustling streets of Antioch, worlds away from the frigid, stone halls of northern Europe or Rome. The true titans of the faith, Augustine, Athanasius, Origen, were sons of the African soil, who stood as immovable pillars at the dawn of the epoch, playing indispensable roles in weaving the intricate fabric of theology, pouring the concrete foundations of orthodoxy, and swinging the sword of truth against the encroaching shadows of heresy. These were not distant Western academics imposing foreign philosophies upon the faith. They were the luminous minds of their own indigenous lands, interpreting the mysteries of the gospel through the prism of their ancient heritage and distinct cultural rhythm. The enduring legends of the Ethiopian patriarchs stand as eternal monuments to a faith that blossomed deep within the heart of Africa, long before it ever traversed the oceans. The massive displacement of the cross from the southern and eastern realms into the hands of Europe was no natural, organic flowering. It was a transformation forged in the fires of conquest and political machination, a deliberate reversal of the tides that shifted the throne of spiritual authority away from the rising sun and toward the setting sun, dragging the center of gravity from the warm south to the cold north. When the winds of empire swept through North Africa and the East during the 7th and 8th centuries, a heavy veil fell, violently severing the ancient roots from their western branches. As the golden glory of Byzantium faded like a dying ember in the night, Rome emerged from the twilight to seize total dominion over the spiritual imagination of the West. The blood-soaked era of the Crusades gouged a canyon of bitter enmity between the cross-bearers of Europe and the indigenous peoples of the Middle East. Through the slow march of centuries, the Western Church tended a solitary, walled garden, cultivating its own insulated doctrines and painting its own icons, which mirrored the faces of its own kings and serfs, rather than the true countenances described in the holy texts. In the fullness of time, these artistic illusions hardened into absolute truth, becoming the distorted lens through which the world blindly gazed upon the sacred figures of antiquity. And yet, the ink upon the ancient parchments remains indelible, defiant, and unaltered by the passage of time or the whims of men. The Hebrew scrolls and Greek letters continue to sing the anthem of a dark-skinned people, radiating the beauty of Africa and the unyielding strength of Ethiopia. Even the stones themselves cry out in testimony, as the archaeologist Spade unearths realities that bind the Semitic ancestors to the lineage of the southern continent. While historians like Tacitus explicitly likened the Jews to the Ethiopians, the painted tombs of Egypt offer their own silent, colorful witness, depicting the Semites with skin the color of rich, reddish-brown earth. The very helix of life, decoded by the instruments of modern science, continues to whisper of an unbreakable genetic bond between the ancients of the Middle East and the children of Africa. The enduring tragedy is that Western eyes turned away from the mirror of history, choosing to embrace comfortable myths rather than accept the stark, magnificent reality of the evidence. Through the long, winding corridors of time, learned men wove intricate, suffocating webs of theory, transforming the raw, beating heart of physical truth into ghostly abstractions that float far above the earth. With every deliberate stroke of the painter's brush, the holy halls were quietly altered, stripping the deep bronze glory from the ancients and replacing it with a spectral pallor that betrayed the sun. Theological bastions were raised high, stone by stone, to persuade the devout that the blood running through the veins of history was but a shadow, a triviality to be discarded in pursuit of a disembodied light. This grand erasure climbed to its terrifying peak as the hunger of empires swelled, carrying a hollowed-out gospel across the heaving seas to mold the spirits of foreign nations into obedient shapes. Upon the soil of the New World, souls bound in iron were forced to bend the knee to a deliverer who wore the face of the very men holding the whip. The first peoples, torn from the sacred earth of their fathers, were given icons of divine warriors that looked suspiciously like the horsemen who rode them down in the dust. Even far to the rising sun, the faithful were fed a polished mirage of the desert prophets, birthing a global faith disconnected from the grit, the heat, and the dark skin of the true ancient scrolls. The faith was severed from its nourishing roots with surgical precision, adorned in the heavy velvet of European monarchs, instead of the coarse, breathing linen of the eastern wilderness. The holy word was strained through the fine sieve of imperial greed, discarding the revolutionary truth until only that which bowed to the throne and the sword remained. But truth carries an eternal, stubborn strength, surviving the deepest burials and the most cunning attempts to rewrite the memory of the world. The old Hebrew tongue stood watch like a silent sentinel in the night, guarding the secrets of form and melanin within the bedrock of its grammar and its hidden roots. Out of the shifting, whispering sands, broken pottery, and ancient stones rose up to sing a new song, defying the false portraits painted by the masters of the Middle Ages. The very double helix of life began to murmur histories that were meant to be forgotten, revealing blood connections that the great Western institutions had tried for centuries to cut away. In this present age of piercing light, our tools become like the lantern of God, scorching away the darkness where the secrets of identity have cowered for so long. Satellites gazing from the heavens trace the true wanderings of the old tribes, while the code within our blood confirms the ancient, unbreakable bridge between the Nile's banks and the Jordan's flow. Linguistics now stitches the holy language back into the colorful, living fabric of African tongues, unveiling a common mother that memory had lost. The evidence has swelled from a trickle to a thundering torrent, a river of reality that waits for any spirit courageous enough to kneel and drink deep. The only question that hangs in the air is whether the flock of today has the heart to accept what the rocks and the very cells of their bodies are shouting. Are they prepared to leave the gold-plated sanctuaries of easy tradition to trek through the harsh, purifying desert of the truth? This goes far beyond the dust of academic arguments. It pierces the very core of the divine enigma who the Almighty chooses, what he holds dear, and how he dances through the ages. It demands a spiritual awakening, a realization that the holy texts are, in their essence, something far more revolutionary than we were told. It is the timeless epic of the Creator's burning love for the crushed, his iron vow to raise the broken from the dust and shatter the high towers of the proud. When the heavy curtain is finally pulled back, and you see that the chosen line wore the rich, dark color of the soil itself, when you look into the eyes of a Messiah whose face holds the warmth of the African sun rather than the chill of a European winter, and when you understand that the patriarchs walked in skin that mirrors those who have known the lash and the chain, the foundations of modern theology begin to quake. It unveils a God who does not anoint the seats of oppressors, but instead grasps the pillars of their power and brings them down. It reveals a Redeemer who stands not in the ranks of the elite guard, but directly in their path, eyes blazing, demanding justice. It declares that the prophecies of old were never meant to preserve the status quo, but to set the world aflame and forge a kingdom of right standing from the ashes. If the finger of God singled out the dark-skinned multitudes as his treasure, if the Son walked among the rejected not as a stranger but as a brother, and if the old covenants promised to lift the scattered and the scorned, then those who carry his name bear a heavy, holy burden to stand shoulder to shoulder with the suffering against those who built their prisons. Great turning points in law, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, hum with the same divine frequency as the commandments etched in stone. They are the modern reverberations of an eternal cry for balance and fairness within the gathering of the true believers. Do not confuse this with the petty politics of men wearing the mask of piety. This is the unavoidable explosion of deep faith spilling into the streets. To truly understand what it means to be chosen is to find yourself driven to fight for the very things that make the heart of heaven beat faster. To see the Anointed One as he truly walked the earth is to find your spirit aligning with the very people he claimed as his own flesh and blood. Taking back this genuine inheritance is not about picking sides in the temporary battles of today's social debates. Instead, it is a climb to a higher spiritual peak, one that overlooks human walls while honoring the Creator's fierce tenderness for those mocked for the color of their skin. Every spirit reflects the face of the infinite. Every nation cradles a precious gem within his vast and intricate design. The countless families of the world carry a royal dignity, each one shimmering with a different light from the limitless imagination of God. The elders of old displayed every shade of the earth's clay, a breathing witness to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, chanting a melody of unity. And yet, over and over, the Almighty has chosen to pour his breath into the lungs of the crushed, the overlooked, and those who have tasted the salt of their own tears. Catching this rhythmic heartbeat within the holy pages allows the seeker to finally see with open eyes. It gives the spirit the strength to steer through the hurricanes of this age, to run toward the cry of the poor, and to sync its rhythm with the pulse of the divine. This revelation lays no bricks for walls between the peoples of the world. Rather, it hammers out an unbreakable chain of love, binding us all together beneath the banner of his uncompromising demand for justice. The unveiling of the true ancestry of the Holy Ones does not divide the faithful. Instead, it weaves us together with a sacred, unbreakable thread, exposing a divine affection that transcends the rigid boundaries drawn by mortal hands, while simultaneously declaring a celestial verdict that shatters the iron yokes of racial oppression. Let every breathing spirit beneath the vault of the sky celebrate the deep enigma of the Creator's choice. For the Infinite One has never cast his gaze upon the superficial things that captivate the human eye. He chose to distill his very essence into vessels forged of obsidian and burnished bronze to birth his covenant people, demonstrating for all eternity that the divine eye pays no heed to the empty grandeur of human thrones or the fleeting arrogance of worldly dominion. Gaze upon the primordial paradox. The sovereign Lord crowned the outcast to bring disgrace upon the powerful, and he wrapped his arms around the weak to leave the mighty in a state of utter confusion. He raised the unseen from the ash heaps to dismantle the pride of earthly rulers. This is the luminous news of salvation for all flesh, a sign that holy love is not a treasure locked away in the vaults of conquerors and kings. On the contrary, this river of mercy surges most violently toward those who have been shoved into the darkness, exiled to the ragged fringes of civilization, invisible to the multitudes, and robbed of the royal nobility that the breath of life instilled within their innermost being. The master weaver's loom spins only a single narrative: the realignment of the cosmic scales and the dawning of a kingdom where the first are cast down into the dust and the last are lifted to walk among the stars. To truly comprehend the bloodline of the chosen is to finally march in rhythm with the pulsing heart of the eternal, synchronizing the modern soul with an ancient, irresistible purpose. However, the secrets laid bare on this hallowed evening are far from the final chapter of this epic. They are merely the initial rumbles of a spiritual earthquake, when the blinding films are peeled from your sight concerning the true ancestry, and you perceive the Messiah exactly as he trod upon the soil. The entire universe transfigures before your gaze. The sacred parchments suddenly ignite within your grasp, glowing with a fresh and consuming flame. Ancient foretellings, once wrapped in the mists of confusion, sharpen into crystalline visions of absolute reality. You begin to follow the golden seams that bind the turbulence of our present age to the timeless blueprints of the Word. Yet, what we have unveiled is but a solitary droplet in a boundless sea of evidence. Legions of concealed verses remain, chanting the anthem of a sun-scorched Israelite legacy that yearns to be rediscovered. Hundreds of neglected manuscripts and annals lie dormant in the dust, bearing witness to the ironclad covenant between the mother continent and the sanctified people. Thousands of mute stones and interred riches scream from the depths of the soil, confirming the sanguinary link between the realms of the Orient and the beating heart of Africa. The very syntax of the prophets harbors mysteries within its roots, syllables that were distorted by the passage of eras to mask the authentic countenance of the forefathers. Even the Hellenistic scrolls murmur of truths that academics attempted to dissolve into mere allegory, terrified of the raw potency of the literal, physical form. The Aramaic archives stand as immovable guardians, protecting a cultural recollection that shatters the fragile porcelain idols sculpted by the West. The profound wisdom of the ancients, locked within the Talmud and the deep reservoirs of midrashic teaching, reveals an Israelite countenance that mirrors the fertile, dark loam of Africa rather than the pale, wintry expanses of Europe. The patriarchs of the faith, standing within the immediate echo of the apostolic era, depicted the Redeemer and his 12 disciples in shades of burnished copper and woolly textures, unmistakable traits of the southern climes. Moreover, the keepers of Islamic enlightenment, who vigilantly protected their own distinct genealogies, have consistently portrayed the majestic prophets, Musa, Dawood, and Isa, possessing deep, melanin-rich complexions of the earth, bearing the aristocratic stamp of African kinship rather than the physiognomy of the northern clans. These images remained uncorrupted, never tainted by the brushes of Renaissance painters, blossoming instead within the fertile soil of Arab and African remembrance. Though doubters and cynics may weaponize the intricacies of DNA and bloodlines, attempting to cut the cord that binds us to the lands beyond the Great Sahara, the torrential currents of time surge in only one direction, merging into an overwhelming deluge of irrefutable evidence that the Holy Ones carried the dark majesty of the continent, walking with the imperial swagger of Ethiopia's ancient monarchs. The solitary voice dissenting against this cosmic choir is the fabrication of Western exegesis, a modern construct that flourished during an age of bloody conquest, designed to uphold the vanity of empires rather than the sanctity of truth. When the shroud of colonial indoctrination is ripped asunder, and one returns to the primal origins before the map was redrawn by avarice, every milestone directs us back to a black biblical reality. However, this hallowed gnosis was never truly obliterated. It was merely concealed within the most improbable of refuges. It resonated in the mournful melodies of the enslaved, spirituals that understood by instinct that the saints they serenaded shared their own dark, sun-drenched likeness. It throbbed within the archaic ceremonies of the motherland, guarding the genetic memory of a blood pact with the people of the scroll. From the four corners of the globe, indigenous tongues arise to recount their connection to the dispersed tribes of Israel, carrying the legend within the very marrow of their bones. Even within the mythos of Europe itself, faint sparks of the primordial reality refuse to be snuffed out. Legends from the medieval era murmur of obsidian-skinned knights and Ethiopian sovereigns, not as aliens from a remote shore, but as central, recognized pillars of the holy narrative. Before the great whitewashing was finalized, the virtuosos of the Renaissance occasionally allowed the truth to slip through their fingers, depicting the holy figures with the unmistakable features of Africa. The verity was indeed interred deep. Yet truth is a wild inferno that cannot be suffocated by the dirt thrown upon it. It has survived in shards, in the quiet murmurs of tradition, and in recollections that predate the very empires that strove to rewrite them. And now, as we stand bathed in the light of 2026, armed with instruments that can gaze into antiquity and bridge the planet, the fractured mosaic is finally being reassembled. This assembly is but the ignition of a revelation so colossal that it will reconstruct the very bedrock of the faith in the coming decades. As the masses rouse from their slumber to embrace the reality of the divine bloodline, as the sealed parchments of antiquity are unfurled by the hands of truthful scribes, and the dormant genetic memories of the Near East are illuminated once more, a deep and holy transfiguration begins to awaken within the souls of the devout. Verily, this is no passing tremor, no momentary ripple that might be restrained by the iron grip of custom, nor stifled by the mute passage of eons. For truth bears a sacred gravity. Once it amasses the density of existence, it transforms into a force that cannot be halted. In that hour, when the unified spirit of humanity fully comprehends the deeds that genuinely unfolded beneath the primordial sun, the delicate fallacies of a bygone era shall simply vanish into the ether. Those revered portrayals from the West, long sanctified by the masses, shall be unveiled as mere cultural echoes of their era, rather than the true and holy countenance of the divine. The depiction of a fair-skinned Redeemer shall be revealed as a tapestry woven by mortal hands, dissolving like vapor in the presence of the luminous, historical substance of the scriptural realm. This grand reclamation of true identity is a benediction that crosses all boundaries of blood, nourishing the inner life of every spirit, and not solely those who trace their roots to the ancient patriarchs. Each devotee now stands upon the threshold of meeting the Messiah as he physically trod the dust of this world, walking in step with the authentic seers and the rightful apostles of antiquity. At long last, the loyal shall discern what the architect chose in his wisdom, what the divine holds most dear, and what the sovereign actually requires of those who invoke his holy name. A transformation of such magnitude within the soul of the world shall not manifest in a mere heartbeat. It demands the gradual rotation of the cosmic wheel to unravel the tapestries of illusion spun over hundreds of years. It exacts the valor of a seasoned warrior from the scholars and seekers who dare to expose the uneasy truths, hazarding their reputations upon the altar of absolute integrity. It summons a deep and resonant bravery from the shepherds of souls, compelling them to proclaim the raw reality from the pulpit, even as the flock shudders at the shattering of their familiar peace. Furthermore, it necessitates an unyielding pledge from the common pilgrim, one who is ready to question the bedrock of inherited tales, regardless of the disquiet it may sow within their own hearts. Nevertheless, the rising of the sun is destined. The luminescence of veracity invariably slices through the gloom of misconception to claim its rightful triumph. Fact is the anvil upon which the hammer of fantasy breaks. The genuine unveiling of the divine inevitably breaches the ramparts of secrecy, cleansing the world of human fabrication. The enigma lies not in whether the authentic visage of scriptural history shall be disclosed to the nations, for that destiny is already inscribed in the firmament. The solitary doubt that lingers concerns your own position when the curtain is finally torn. Shall you assist the awakening, or shall you stand as a monolith of defiance against it? Will you offer your strength to the restoration of the holy, ancient likenesses, or will you grasp desperately at the soothing familiarity of a gilded falsehood? Will you raise the banner for sincere wisdom and learning, or will you withdraw into the citadel of conventional dogma? The trajectory you select determines far more than your perspective on days of old. It sculpts the very core of your reaction to the pleas for righteousness in this current age. It tints your interpretation of the omens surrounding us and deepens your comprehension of your holy obligation as a bearer of light in a world famished for the true evangel. The genuine anointed one carried the rich hue of the soil, his countenance mirroring the deep African ancestry of that sacred land, forging a biological covenant with present-day peoples who have tasted the gall of tyranny and lived beneath the dark cloud of exclusion. He aligned himself unshakably with those who mourned for justice, never with the potentates who brandished their authority like a bludgeon against the defenseless. His divine charge was to pulverize the fetters of the captive, not to supply a cloak of virtue for the jailer who clutches the key. He drew unto himself followers who reflected his own visage, who partook of his lineage, and who inhaled the very same cultural atmosphere. This Savior stands as a lighthouse of promise for all flesh, demonstrating that celestial love is unfettered by mortal rankings of aesthetics, sway, or entitlement. However, his narrative chants a particular hymn of deliverance for the discarded, for those deemed meritless, and for those scrubbed from the scrolls of holy remembrance. The dignitary from Ethiopia, recorded in Acts chapter 8, was not clutching at an alien, distant god as he perused the parchments. Rather, he was unearthing the spiritual cistern of his forefathers. Even the Queen of Sheba, on her pilgrimage to Solomon, was no foreign curiosity gazing from without. She was a royal mother acknowledging her own blood. The wise men from the Orient who quested for the Christ child were not remote wanderers stumbling through the night. They were far-flung kinsmen, steered by the constellations and the ancient oracles that were the property of their own tribes, in search of their foretold sovereign. To fully apprehend these profound linkages, is to transmute the very manner in which we engage the sacred writ, beholding it with a renewed vision. It exposes holy designs that have been shrouded for eons and elucidates kinships that have been misconstrued for countless generations. It restores majesty and reverence to peoples who have been methodically erased from their rightful spiritual patrimony. This great rousing is not intended to gouge fresh abysses between the families of the globe. It is about suturing the gashes of antiquity, reclaiming stolen selves, and reverting to a scriptural reality that rallies all beneath the standard of heavenly love, whilst respecting the Creator's fervent passion for the oppressed. The disclosure of scriptural ethnic essence is, fundamentally, a deep and resonant manifestation of the Creator's own character, his timeless principles, and his magnificent blueprint for the chronicle of humanity. When you discern whom the Supreme Being truly consecrated, you start to grasp his longings. When you visualize the Messiah in his true form, you fathom the abyss of his instructions. When you clasp the true saga of the writings to your breast, you unleash a more profound gratitude for the bona fide tidings of the gospel. This word is intended for the entire earth, yet it vibrates with a unique resonance for those shoved to the periphery and told they possess no dwelling place within the book. Know this: your ancestors stood firm at the very bedrock of the belief. Your legacy is threaded like spun gold throughout the vast weave of the story, and your very image is etched in the ink of the primal manuscripts. Your bond is ratified by the science of the modern age. You are no longer compelled to genuflect before the Eurocentric shadows of history. The verity has indeed liberated you. There is no celestial law binding you to bow before the twisted interpretations of conquerors who sought to carve the ancient scrolls into their own likeness. You are under no burden to accept the grand illusion that the divine's chosen vessels bore no resemblance to your own reflection. Indeed, the spiritual reality is the absolute inversion of that persistent lie. The anointed ones of the Most High were the very mirror of your image. The Messiah walked this earth sharing your blood, and the apostles carried your physical essence within their veins. This profound truth should kindle a sacred fire of dignity within your soul, forging an unshakable confidence in your spiritual lineage and emboldening your testimony before the nations of the world. Hearken to this wisdom. You are not converting to the religion of a stranger. You are embarking on a glorious homecoming to the ancient faith of your forefathers. You are not clothing yourself in the cultural robes of foreign lands. You are stepping back into the sacred rhythms and traditions that were originally birthright yours from the dawn of time. You are not offering praise to the deity of another tribe. You are mending the severed bond with the God of your own kin. Yet, let this message also vibrate within the hearts of those whose lineage differs from the ancient tribes. You forfeit nothing by embracing the authentic history of the scriptures. Instead, you fling open the gates to the unfiltered gospel, encountering the true Messiah and the raw, unpolished narrative of the Bible. You are being summoned to participate in a communion far vaster, deeper, and more potent than the diluted interpretations handed down by Western tradition. The true biblical saga is a testament to the Creator's boundless love for all of humanity, beautifully articulated. Through his sovereign choice of a specific people destined to be the living, breathing embodiment of his heart for justice, mercy, and righteousness. When you grasp that these chosen vessels were of dark skin, oppressed and marginalized, you perceive with divine clarity what the Almighty requires of all his children, regardless of their origin. You are called to harmonize your spirit with the broken rather than the tyrant. You are beckoned to stand immovable with the outcast, not with those who rest in seats of privilege. You are mandated to champion justice for every soul, specifically honoring those who bear the physical likeness of the original biblical saints. This revelation seeks not to weigh you down with guilt, but to bring you into symphonic alignment with the Creator's heart and his eternal plan. The resurrection of biblical ethnic identity serves the spiritual welfare of all, for it restores the authentic power of the gospel message, which thunders a call to repentance, extends salvation to every believer, and demands unwavering justice from all who claim the name of the Anointed One. Even the secular decrees of our age, such as the United Nations Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice of 1978, echo these ancient biblical mandates for justice and dialogue. The truths unveiled in this sacred hour will resound through the halls of Christendom for generations yet unborn. Some will embrace it instantly, finding confirmation for the whispers in their souls. Others may initially raise shields of resistance, for this piercing light challenges the shadows they have long accepted as their reality. Yet, in the fullness of time, every soul must reckon with this truth, for truth is a relentless force that permeates every conversation and theological debate. The mountain of evidence has grown too high to be overlooked or circumvented. The scriptural foundations are too distinct to deny. The historical records are too vast and detailed to be swept aside like dust. The scientific validation is too absolute to reject. The reality that God's chosen possessed dark skin is no mere hypothesis or fleeting opinion. It is an immutable fact, obscured by centuries of fog, that can no longer be held back by the trembling hands of men. The weight of responsibility now rests upon your shoulders. How will you respond to this piercing illumination? Will you plunge deeper into the mysteries to uncover even more proof? Will you become a messenger of this hidden wisdom to those who hunger for it? Will you allow this ancient knowledge to reshape your vision of prophecy, justice, and your sacred duties in this era of 2026? The path you choose is yours alone, yet the truth remains as unshakable as the stars in the firmament, regardless of your decision. The chosen people of God were dark of hue. The Savior bore the visage of the African continent. The figures of the Bible were ethnically akin to modern populations that have endured the long night of historical oppression. This reality is etched in Hebrew, unearthed by archaeology, mapped in the codes of genetics, and verified by the annals of independent history. You may open your inner heart to align with this biblical reality, or you may stand in resistance, clinging to comfortable myths, yet you possess no power to alter, suppress, or banish the truth. The reality of the chosen ones is breaking forth from centuries of darkness, and nothing can halt its full revelation. We ask you to meditate deeply on this unveiling. Spread this illumination to others. Investigate the archives for yourself, and find even greater confirmation of what has been spoken here. The truth regarding biblical ethnic identity is not merely a dusty relic of ancient history. It is a vibrant, contemporary reality with profound implications for every facet of your spiritual walk. The true inquiry is no longer whether the chosen people were dark-skinned. The evidence has rendered that undeniable. The pressing question is how you will act now that the veil has been lifted. How will this gnosis transform your faith? How will it revolutionize your concept of justice? How will it guide your hand in the face of oppression? How will it transfigure your connection with those who walk today in the image of the biblical ancestors? These are the soulful inquiries that will determine if this night's revelation becomes a metamorphic fire in your life, or merely fleeting knowledge lost to the wind. Before your very eyes, the road of destiny forks, offering a choice of infinite consequence, yet the primordial, immutable truth remains anchored like an eternal mountain, utterly unmoved by the shifting winds of mortal opinion. Within the vast, star-strewn architecture of the cosmos, the divine architect chose a people of deep, resonant radiance to carry the heavy mantle of his holy covenant, a profound election that unveils the beating heart of the Almighty and exposes the intricate golden threads he has woven into the fabric of human history. To forge a bond of spirit that shatters the earth with its gravity, we must now descend from the high peaks of revelation and tread upon the dusty soil of unity, cultivating a profound and enduring resonance between kindred souls. Let us skillfully interlace the strands of diverse traditions, orchestrating sacred symphonies of dialogue that illuminate the magnificent, biblically rooted variety concealed within the pages of the Holy Scrolls. We tread in the glowing footprints of the sages, guided by beacons such as desiring God's 10 pathways toward ethnic harmony, immersing our spirits in the ocean of Scripture to hear the clarion call for total oneness among all the tribes of the earth. The hour has struck to unlock the sealed chambers of our hearts, trading our most intimate stories across the chasms of heritage to bridge the void, hosting worship assemblies that reflect the celestial glory described in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. Cast your gaze upon that endless, numberless ocean of souls standing before the radiant throne of heaven. Clasp hands with fellow pilgrims and guiding fellowships like Converge or InterVarsity, drawing upon their tested wisdom to navigate this sacred odyssey. Plunge yourself into the unique splendor of your neighbor's heritage, engaging in a gospel-anchored outreach that transcends mere tolerance, choosing instead to joyously celebrate the distinctions the Creator has so purposefully ordained. This holy labor releases a soothing balm of restoration and healing, resonating with the profound spiritual insights unearthed within the depths of Lifeway's scholarly research. Their revelations unveil a spiritual axiom: that when we deliberately seek to understand and share the raw truths of our lived journeys, the towering fortress walls of division within our sanctuaries begin to crumble into nothingness. Whether we congregate in quiet, candlelit circles, connect through the invisible currents of digital forums, or unite in bold church movements, we hold the alchemy to transform this revelation into living breath, building bridges, demanding justice, and manifesting the very essence of Christ's love in a shattered world. I beseech you, O seekers of the eternal, to journey into the dusty archives of time, consulting venerable guardians of knowledge, like the Biblical Archaeology Review, to acquire a vision that is both spiritually balanced and intellectually profound. And guard this pearl of wisdom within your spirit. While some eyes perceive the ancient parchments as speaking of literal flesh, a host of scholars discern metaphors shimmering like mirages beneath the surface of the word. This divine ambiguity is not a weapon to sever us, but a welcoming gateway, inviting us into an everlasting communion, a conversation that expands the caverns of our collective soul rather than tearing its fabric asunder. Ultimately, let our heartbeats merge into a single rhythm in pursuit of God's kingdom, a glorious realm where every nation, every tribe, and every tongue shines as a priceless jewel, set firmly in the crown of the King of Kings.